Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for tonight's program, Publishing Around the World with Zachary Baker. This evening's program is presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's 2023 Decade of Discovery, Yiddish Around the World. Before we get started, a few things to note. Your video and audio will be off throughout the program. You may send questions via the question panel located at the lower right of your screen. We ask that you keep questions short and refrain from comments so that we can try to get to all the questions this evening. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's presenter, Zachary Baker. Zachary served as the Reinhardt Family Curator of Judaica and Hebraica collections at the Stanford University Libraries for 18 years until he retired in 2018. Before coming to Stanford, he started out as a cataloger of Yiddish books in the library of YIVO Institute for Jewish Research from 1976 to 1981. Subsequently, he was YIVO's head librarian for 12 years, serving from 1987 to 1999. In between his stints at YIVO, he worked at the Jewish Public Library of Montreal for 6 years as head of its Yiddish department and technical services. Zachary is a longtime collaborator and great friend of the Yiddish Book Center. He contributes to Pakenträger, the Yiddish Book Center's English language member magazine, and is the compiler of the Yiddish Book Center's Essential Yiddish Books. Welcome, Zachary.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everybody. It's still daylight out here in Northern California, and it stopped raining. You may have heard about 3 weeks of successive waves of what they call atmospheric rivers, a term that I was unfamiliar with before I moved to California 23 years ago. So my talk this evening ties into the theme of the Yiddish Book Center for 2023, which is Global Yiddish. And what could be a more quintessentially global phenomenon when we're speaking about Yiddish than publishing? Let me share my screen with you. So, what you see before you is a map of the world from a school atlas published in Moscow in 1928. No, the atlas did not have a caption in English at the top saying Yiddish Publishing ... I managed to squeeze that in by some miracle. And you see the continents and the oceans and the seas and the bays and all of that labeled in beautiful Soviet orthography in Yiddish. On every single continent at some point, except one, there was some publishing in Yiddish at some point in time. Since this isn't really an interactive presentation, I won't leave you to chime in, except maybe if there's a chat function you want to guess which continent no publishing in Yiddish took place. I'll give you a hint. It's at the very bottom of the globe, very, very bottom of the globe. So what I'm going to be speaking about this evening is not everything all at once, everything everywhere all at once, but rather little snapshots of Yiddish publishing in different parts of the world. And what influenced the trajectory of Yiddish publishing in these different places. And I can point to, or one can point to, international migration patterns, political and economic factors, and such like, and that influenced where Yiddish publishing flourished and when. And after 1945, in the wake of the Holocaust, new centers of Yiddish publishing emerged, even in the face of widespread adoption by Jews of other languages. So tonight I'm offering some hands-on observations from my 4+ decades as a Judaica librarian, especially from my early years as a cataloger of Yiddish books at YIVO and as head of the Jewish Public Library's Yiddish department in Montreal. And during those years, thousands of different Yiddish books and hundreds of periodicals from all over the world crossed my desks. In addition, during that period, from 1976 to 1999, I compiled a list of newly published Yiddish books for the Jewish Book Annual, a publication that ceased publication in 1999. This was an assignment that I inherited from YIVO's head librarian, the late Dina Abramovich, when I started out as a cataloger in 1976 at YIVO. And in those years, between 75 and 125 new Yiddish books were coming out each year. And this is just a sample, and you see my handwritten marginalia or notes where there was a typo under the name on the left-hand page of Ignatov, where they left out the Yud, but this is from my personal copy of the very first bibliography of new Yiddish books that I prepared for that publication. So today I'll be describing highlights of Yiddish publishing across the globe as viewed from 10,000 feet. It's not a comprehensive history or overview of the history of Yiddish publishing, though I'll note that there have been some excellent in-depth scholarly studies, especially over the past couple of decades, both on individual publishers and on Yiddish publishing in specific countries and locales. Over the years, the Yiddish Book Center has shared some of their unusual finds with me, which I've written about for the Pakenträger. And these rarities reflect some of the global reach of Yiddish publishing, ranging from Soviet Russia to Brazil. Also, a dozen or so years ago, the Yiddish Book Center put their bibliographical database at my disposal and commissioned me to compile this list of 1,000 essential Yiddish books, which is accessible through the Book Center's website. What you see on screen is a PDF version of that list, or a page from it or two. Now, compiling a list of this nature is subjective in nature, and I took the liberty of also adding at the time some titles that were not in the Book Center's database back then, and that included works by Chaim Grade and Isaac Bashevis Singer, along with some scholarly editions published by the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And as I compiled this list, I felt a tinge of what they call imposter syndrome. I looked over my shoulder nervously when the list was published for fear of being unmasked by literary scholars who certainly would have noticed the exclusion of their favorite authors from a list of essential Yiddish books, plus the works of Grade and Bashevis. I should note, by the way, I'll interject, I'm interjecting myself, that this list was compiled and released shortly before the digital library of the Yiddish Book Center went online. So that, in a way, it was a prelude to the release of that list. I looked over this essential Yiddish books list, but while I was preparing this talk, and I counted works from 33 different cities on most of the continents that I alluded to at the beginning. Many of the most significant Yiddish publishing centers in the late 19th and 20th centuries are included in the list, though there are some notable gaps, and I'll mention three. One is Riga in Latvia, another is Johannesburg in South Africa, and the third is Shanghai in China. I'll also mention that the more recent phenomenon of Hasidic Yiddish publishing in locales such as Brooklyn and Muncie is also absent from essential Yiddish books. So in a way, to repeat myself, the entries in the list are distilled from what the Yiddish Book Center had on its shelves at the time. And what did it have on its books at the time? Well, a disproportionate number of imprints in the Book Center's holdings back then were published in New York before World War II. And also, I might note, post-1945 publications from Buenos Aires were somewhat overrepresented. There was a significant underrepresentation of books from pre-war Poland and the Soviet Union. And I think that if you want to get a sense of why that was the case, I'd recommend that you read Aaron Lansky's book, Outwitting History, which describes the collecting efforts of the Yiddish Book Center in its early period, which was concentrated, the efforts were concentrated back then in the early decades in the United States and Canada, and editions from, let's say, from Eastern Europe were, comparatively speaking, underrepresented in the private libraries of most North American Yiddish book collectors. So many of the more prominent Soviet Yiddish authors who were active in the 1920s and 30s are represented in Essential Yiddish Books by editions that were published later on in North and South America, and also in the Soviet Union after the death of Joseph Stalin. So again, to repeat myself, I drew upon my experience as a Yiddish cataloger and bibliographer at YIVO and the Jewish Public Library in compiling this list. Now, the collection that I was hired to catalog at YIVO in 1976 was its pre-1939 Vilna collection, most of which, not surprisingly, consisted of European imprints. And I can explain in the Q&A if you want to know more why it was called the Vilna collection. So the books in that collection included a mix of original Yiddish fiction, poetry, and drama for adults and children, along with a variety of nonfiction genres. Works in translation, both fiction and nonfiction, were also abundant in the Vilna collection. There were a lot of Soviet editions in the YIVO Library's Vilna Yiddish collection, including among them translated works by such notable non-literary authors as Lenin, Kaganovich, Molotov, and Stalin. So-called Shund novels, popular lowbrow fiction, are also found in the Vilna collection in some abundance. And these included chapbooks by the likes of Schomer, Isaac Mayer Dick, and the now totally obscure Yankov Psanta. I had a coworker who was born in Chernovitz and raised in Chernovitz in Bukovina, and it was Romania when she was growing up, and she considered the works of Psanta, who was also a Romanian writer, to be much superior to those of Sholem Aleichem. I guess there was kind of a local appeal in Psanta's writings that Sholem Aleichem for her, that was missing for her. Now, if you saw the announcement for this talk earlier this week, you probably noticed the mention of a series called Groschen Bibliothek. And when I was at YIVO in those days, 40 some odd years ago, I cataloged dozens upon dozens of booklets in the Groschen Bibliothek series, which was published in interwar Warsaw. And so you see, by the way, the pseudonym Dalet Koppelman on the Albert Einstein example to the right, that's one of many, many pseudonyms by the writer Yankov Koppel Dua. And I wrote an article about that, which was published very early in my career. Also, while working at the Jewish Public Library, I cataloged its collection of Yiddish periodicals and also many of the audio recordings that are now online through the Yiddish Book Center. Essential Yiddish Books include some titles that are also drawn from the list of new Yiddish books that I compiled in the 70s and 80s, and also in the 90s. And that lends or adds to the chronological bias post-1945 of Essential Yiddish Books. Nevertheless, and it seems paradoxical, but despite a steadily declining readership for Yiddish during that period, the 70s and onward, I feel that the quarter century from 1945 to 1970 when I wasn't compiling those lists, was a silver age of Yiddish publishing. Some of the best known Yiddish writers were active during the post-World War II era. And during those several decades, Buenos Aires and Tel Aviv came to occupy prominent positions on the world map of Yiddish publishing. I made a point of including a range of nonfiction titles, non-literary titles in essential Yiddish books. And in that list, you'll find memoirs, biographies, literary history and criticism, journalism, typography, philology, education, folklore, theater, music, humor, Jewish history, religion, political movements, Holocaust documentation, reference works, and a few of the notable periodicals that are found in the Yiddish Book Center's database. And I'll show you one shortly. Translations are largely excluded from essential Yiddish books, aside from the Tanakh, the Bible, and the New Testament, and also Shakespeare's sonnets. I was once asked if I could bring only 2 books with me to a desert island, what would they be? And I answered the Tanakh in Hebrew and English, and also not the New Testament, but Shakespeare. I guess that reflects my education. There are works that are not included in the Yiddish Book Center's public database of digitized books due to copyright concerns, though a few of them are included in essential Yiddish books. In other words, the Yiddish Book Center had them on their shelves, but they didn't digitize them. And there were others that have been added that were included in essential Yiddish books that weren't online or weren't in the original online version of the database, but have been added to it since then. And the prime example of that are books in the Musterwerk series from Buenos Aires. Now, if I were to do over the essential Yiddish books list, I would make a point of adding titles from unrepresented regions, especially South Africa. And there are doubtless some authors that I completely overlooked at the time. Moving on from essential Yiddish books, the question sometimes is asked, how do and did Yiddish books get published and disseminated? There's no single straightforward answer to this question. In the United States, Argentina, and to some extent Israel, commercial publishers coexisted with Landsmannschaften, newspapers, and ad hoc book committees acting as Yiddish book publishers. In a few instances, the deep pockets of a private entrepreneur or the generosity of a philanthropist underwrote the publishing enterprise. In the Soviet Union, Yiddish publishing was sustained and closely monitored by agencies of the state. And in Israel, as we'll see shortly, the Histadrut Labor Federation and writers' associations have supported Yiddish book production. Also, tours by Yiddish authors peddling their books were instrumental toward ensuring that their books found their way to readers. We'll turn now, maybe you're thinking at long last, to some specific examples of publications that illustrate the vast geographical spread of Yiddish publishing. With a few exceptions, these examples draw upon the Yiddish Book Center's collections, directly or indirectly. The first example we see on our screen now is from Kiev, the present-day capital of Ukraine. It was the Yiddish Volksbibliothek. Now you see it transliterated here, die Jüdische, but it would have been pronounced the Yiddish Volksbibliothek. Kiev in 1888 was not a major center of Yiddish book publishing. Indeed, until the years following the 1917 revolution, it remained a rather secondary locus of Yiddish publishing. But in that year, 1888, one of the most important almanacs in Yiddish literary history, this one, was edited there, and it's accessible online through the Yiddish Book Center's digital library. Its editor was none other than Sholem Aleichem, who at that juncture was still in his 20s, and the volume's publication was underwritten by his late father-in-law's estate. As Jeremy Dalber relates in his 2013 book, The Worlds of Shalom Aleichem, the Yiddish Volksbibliothek came out shortly before Shalom Aleichem squandered his inherited fortune at the Kiev Stock Exchange. As an investor, Solomon Rabinovich, like his future literary creation, Menachem Mendel, turned out to be something of a schlemiel. And now back to the Yiddish Volksbibliothek. In its pages are found literary works by such famous Yiddish authors as Mendel and Moichet Sforim, his pen name of Sholem Yankiv Abramovich, or literary persona thereof, Yud Linetsky, Yitzchak Ber Levinson, David Frischmann, Eliakim Zunzer, and Yitzchak Leibush Peretz, represented here by his poem Monish, which I believe was his first literary venture in Yiddish in this volume. It also includes a substantial section devoted to criticism, history, and journalism. The Yiddish Volksbibliothek was a highly ambitious undertaking, and it's cast a long shadow over modern Yiddish literature. Publications in the Russian Empire, and I'm pointing my cursor there, were subject to rigorous censorship until conditions loosened up a bit after the 1905 revolution. And this publication was no exception. And the censor's mark appears on the back of the volume's title page. And incidentally, while the volume was published in Kiev, or Yechupetz, as Shalom Aleichem referred to it in his fiction, it was actually printed in Berdichev, which is the model, I've read somewhere, the model for Shalom Aleichen's fictitious town of Kasrilivka, deep in the Russian Pale of Settlement. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, Kiev became a center of Yiddish avant-garde publishing for a few years through such organizations as the Kulturliga. And well into the 1930s, it remained a major locus of Yiddish printing and publishing, this time under government auspices. We move on next to New York, and it would require the patience and skills of a venturesome and tenured scholar to chronicle the entire 150-year-long history of Yiddish publishing in New York City and environs. And the story is far from over. During the past few decades, for example, Yiddish publishing ventures targeted at Hasidic readers in New York and beyond have proliferated, but that's not my focus here. Instead, I'll touch upon commercial publishing in New York during the era of mass immigration before World War I, when this country's unfettered capitalist marketplace offered unparalleled opportunities for the enterprising Yiddish publisher. Government censorship was not a factor. International copyright laws had yet to be respected on either side of the Atlantic. And the mass audience that was taking shape in the New World was constantly replenished by successive waves of immigration from Eastern Europe. New York's Hebrew Publishing Company serves as the prime example of a commercial publisher in Yiddish, Hebrew, and English that enjoyed decades of success. The enterprise was formed in 1901 through a merger of 4 New York booksellers and publishers, led by Yehuda Meir Katzenellenbogen and Yosef Verbelovsky. To mark its 50th anniversary in 1951, the Hebrew Publishing Company put out a thick catalog listing hundreds of publications that it offered for purchase, along with religious articles such as Kiddush cups, talesim, and even chuppahs and Torah scrolls. Need a chuppah? The Hebrew Publishing Company is there for you. And this catalog is online through the Yiddish Book Center's digital library. By 1951, the company's bread and butter consisted of religious texts, like the Harkavi Pentateuch that we had in the conservative synagogue that I had my bar mitzvah in 1,000 years ago, as my mother would have said, and the Birnbaum Siddur, for instance. But when I asked my grandfather to tutor me in Yiddish one summer during my college years. At his request, our local Judaica store, Brochens on Minnetonka on Lake Street in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, was able to procure the 6 volumes of Jacob Levin's Yiddish primers, Der Anfänger, which you can see somewhere on these pages. Maybe I have it a little, maybe, no, I don't have it there. Sorry, move back. There. And the Hebrew Publishing had produced it several decades earlier, and I'm like about 4.5 decades before I was studying. I was being tutored by my grandfather, but it was still available, and this was a primer starting basically with the Aleph Beis, the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet. Fortunately, I had advanced beyond that stage when I studied with him. My grandfather, who was a graduate of the Teachers Institute of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, class of 1912, had once taught these same texts to American-born bar mitzvah boys who were expected to deliver speeches in Yiddish back in the 1920s and 30s. The genres in the Hebrew Publishing Company's 1951 catalog run the gamut: Jewish history, greeting cards, Bibles, sermons, Haggadot, dictionaries, Sidurim, Machzorim, Salichis, Mina Loshen, Tehillim, Techinas, methods for learning methods for learning English, Hebrew and Yiddish textbooks, Yiddish literature, and pages of sheet music. Over the past 4 decades, copies of many of the company's books, along with cartons of sheet music, have been gathered by the Yiddish Book Center. I'm going to have to skip over a few things here, because I see that I've spent a little too much time caressing the essential Yiddish books narrative, but I will simply add that if you wanted to buy books by classic Yiddish authors, you could buy some editions of Peretz and Mendele from the Hebrew Publishing Company, but not Sholem Aleichem. And this was not where you would go for avant-garde Yiddish literature, although many of the famous Shund authors are represented there. I'll move on now to Warsaw and Vilna. And as the historian Eric Goldstein has shown, the flow of Yiddish books traveled in both directions across the Atlantic, and indeed throughout the globe. And this was the case as far back as the 1890s, when Yehuda Meir Katzenellenbogen in New York was shipping books from New York to his brother Mordechai Katzenellenbogen, who was a bookseller in Vilna. And a similar exchange took place during the years right before World War I between the Warsaw-based publisher and bookseller Yankiv Litsky and his American suppliers. The phenomenon of pirated editions was another characteristic of that period, and writers such as Mendele vociferously objected to the Hebrew Publishing Company's indulgence in this practice. But we should note that simultaneously, Yiddish publishers in Poland were churning out unauthorized editions of Yiddish plays by New York-based writers. And that was a boon for the Yiddish theater troupes that were sprouting up in Tsarist Russia following the 1905 revolution. The most prestigious Yiddish publishing house in Europe before World War II was the Vilner Verlag von Beis Aleph Kletzkin, which, as its name suggests, was launched in Vilna. It was launched before the First World War, and it relocated to Warsaw during the 1920s. Its publisher, Boris Kletzkin, was independently wealthy, though his funds eventually ran out, and he was one of the first Yiddish publishers to pay advances and honoraria to authors. The roster of the Kletzkin Verlag's collaborators reads like a who's who of Yiddish literature from that period. And you see two examples on your screen here. David Bergelson on the right, his novel Nach Allemen, published by Kletzkin in 1913. And well, Knut Hamsun was not a Yiddish writer, but the translator of Victoria was a then unknown young man named Yud Bashevis, published in 1929. And other writers in the Kletzkin universe included Peretz Hirschbein, Hay Leivik, Hirsch David Nomberg, Yosef Opatoshu, Avram Reisen, and many others. Kletzkin also published several pioneering journals, including the children's magazine Grinike Bemelach, the philological collection, which you see on the screen here, Der Pincus, and the weekly Literarische Blätter. And this is a weekly publication, the likes of which nothing like it before or since in the annals of Yiddish journalism or publishing in general. Indeed, there's never been anything quite comparable to the Kletzkin Verlag's output in the annals of Yiddish publishing. I'll move on to another center of Yiddish publishing, Buenos Aires. People who know me know that I'm somewhat fascinated by Yiddish theater in Buenos Aires. And I'll get to that in a second. But it really emerged, Buenos Aires, as a world capital, a world center of Yiddish publishing only after World War II. And that was exemplified by the efforts of Mark Turkov, a community leader who launched the series Das Polnische Judentum, and the educator and critic Shmuel Rozhansky, who edited the Musterwerk von der Jiddischer Literatur, a kind of modern library canon of Yiddish literature. And in recent years, there's been some scholarship devoted to both of these series, including an article by Jan Schwartz in the Pakenträger, but they're not what I'm going to talk about here. Rather, I'm going to focus on a couple of Yiddish plays that were published in Buenos Aires much earlier, at a time before Buenos Aires was, let's say, a world center of Yiddish publishing, but rather the plays that I'm going to talk about are typical of the local orientation of publishing ventures in cities that were far removed from the great European and North American centers of Jewish immigrant life. In 1940, Shmuel Rozhansky observed that the Yiddish printed word had taken root in Argentina. The country's Yiddish press and book publishing before World War II held up a mirror to the experiences of Eastern European Jewish immigrants living in Argentina. The two plays I'm talking about both had productions on the country's stages. This one, the first one, Ibergus by Leib Malach, was the focus of a volcanic controversy that rocked the Argentine Jewish community in the 1920s. Its production set off a battle royal between the two Yiddish dailies of Buenos Aires over the presence of so-called impure members of the theater-going public, meaning sex traffickers and sex workers, and over the alleged influence of these players, these personalities, concerning the repertory that was being put on in the Yiddish theaters. As Rozhansky wrote, these unsavory figures were Argentina's very first Jews. Now, on the left, you see a cast list, and those of you who attended productions at the Volksbühne in New York will recognize this name, Shifra Lehrer. She played a young sailor in this production, pants role, or a trouser role, you could call it. So in the 1890s, the impure Jews of Argentina were joined by thousands of others who came there to that country. And these Jews settled in the agricultural colonies that were established by the Jewish Colonization Association with the support of Baron Maurice de Hirsch in Paris. The Argentine-born writer Shmuel Glazerman was a young Yiddish playwright and critic who was raised on one of the agricultural colonies, and in the 1920s, he wrote a play called Zisya the Goy, whose central character was an unruly Jewish gaucho on the Argentine Pampas. The play was a hit when it was first produced in Buenos Aires in 1930, and you see the actor Samuel Goldenberg in the role of Zisya in that production, and it was included in a volume of Glazerman's Dramatische Schriften, his dramatic writings that was published in 1932. Unfortunately, that volume is not online in the Yiddish Book Center's digital library. The local focus of the these early plays is rather typical of a pattern that was followed in other centers of the Yiddish-speaking diaspora, such as Chicago, Montreal, Melbourne, Johannesburg, and as we shall see, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. And in each of these cities, at one time or another, you'd find a Yiddish newspaper and Yiddish books, and some of them also saw the publication of popular magazines and literary journals. Our next stop is after 1945 in Germany. There were two brief outbursts of Yiddish publishing in Germany during the 20th century. The first of these occurred during the 1920s, mainly in Berlin. The second wave took place after 1945 and was centered in displaced persons camps and urban centers in the British and American zones of occupation in Germany and Austria, including the Bavarian capital, Munich. Hundreds of Yiddish newspapers, magazines, and books were published in post-war Germany and Austria during those years. They were subsidized by overseas relief agencies such as the Joint Distribution Committee and ORT, and by Zionist organizations. Many of the publication's authors and editors had survived ghettos and concentration camps, while others spent the war years as refugees in the Soviet Union. Some had been imprisoned in the Soviet Union and the Gulag, and many had experienced great privation in the cities and towns of Soviet Central Asia. It's a cliche to assert that Holocaust survivors remained silent concerning their ordeals, but nothing could be further from the truth. Bibliographies on the Holocaust include entries for thousands of Yiddish books and articles that appeared in the European DP camps and also in Poland and France during the post-war years. Indeed, among these publications were the first attempts at scholarship on the Holocaust, an example of which you see on the screen. Israel Kaplan was a Lithuanian Jew who survived the ghettos of Slobodka next to Kaunas and Riga, and then the concentration camps of Kaiserwald, also near Riga, and Dachau. In 1932, he graduated from Kaunas University with a degree in history, and thus he had both the credentials and the personal life experience to edit one of the very first journals devoted to Holocaust documentation, Von letzten Horden, from the last extermination, which was published by the Central Historical Commission of the Liberated Jews in the American Zone of Germany. 10 issues of this publication came out in Munich from 1946 to 48. And in addition, Kaplan published a list of popular expressions and pithy sayings by Yiddish-speaking Jews under the occupation. He published this in 1947, Das Volksmäul in Nazi Klem, and an English translation came out in 2018, The Jewish Voice in the Ghettos and Concentration Camps. A revised and expanded edition came out in Yiddish in Tel Aviv in 1982. Kaplan settled in Israel in 1949, where he continued to write and publish in both Yiddish and Hebrew until his death in 2003 at the age of 101. I'm not going to give you a full translation of the expressions on this page, but I'll point out one that was used or encountered in the Baltic countries during the occupation, Yivo, and that stood for Yidden Willen Azoi. It's wishful thinking on the part of Jews. This is what Jews want, they expect, good news instead of the horrible experiences that they were undergoing in these ghettos and camps. So next we come to Tel Aviv. And the last time I was at the Yiddish Book Center, it's more than 10 years ago, I was shown boxes and boxes filled with runs of Yiddish periodicals. And one of these was the literary journal Die Goldene Cape, whose first issue came out in Tel Aviv in the winter of 1949 under the sponsorship of the Israeli Labor Federation, the Histadrut. The editor of the journal for many years until it ended in publication in 1995 was the poet Avram Sutzkever, who was a former member of the Jung Vilna group of Yiddish writers, He was also a participant in the fabled paper brigade in the Vilna Ghetto, and he testified at the Nuremberg war crimes trials in 1946. During the 1950s and 60s, publishing houses such as Hamanora, Israel Book, Yud Lamed Peretz, and Hey Levitt came into existence. Each of them was sponsored by one arm or another of the Israeli labor movement, or in the case of Hey Levitt Farlag, by the Yiddish Writers Association in Israel. About 15 years ago, I estimated that these four publishers accounted for between 1,500 and 2,000 Yiddish book titles published from the 1950s until 2000. I'll move on now to Moscow, but Moscow after Stalin. The main centers of Yiddish publishing in the Soviet Union during the 1920s and 30s were Kiev and Kharkiv in Ukraine, Minsk in Belarus, and the capital city of Moscow. Yiddish publishing was shut down, Yiddish culture was shut down in 1948, and dozens upon dozens of writers were imprisoned, deported to the Gulag, and in some cases executed. Yiddish publishing resumed only very fitfully in 1959 with the release of a couple of anthologies by Sholem Aleichem and Peretz. And then, in the summer of 1961, the first issue of the monthly journal Sovetish Heimland came out. And this is, you see the number one, that's not the very first issue, but that's the first issue that came out the following year in January of 1962. Sovetish Heimland was intended to represent, as its editor Aaron Vergelis put it, the organic connection of Yiddish writers to the Soviet Union and to Soviet literature overall. Some of its original contributors would emigrate to Israel in the 1970s, where they became organic fixtures of the Israeli Yiddish literary scene and non-persons back in Moscow. There was another, a book publishing agency in the Soviet Union, Sovietsky Pisatel, published a number of Yiddish books starting also in the 1960s. This is an example of a beautifully designed edition of Zalmanyaner by Moshe Kulbach. And they were, Sovietsky Pisatel published books in several languages. They published about 5 books a year in Yiddish during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And the Israeli Yiddish literary scholar Chona Shmeruk estimated that a total of 127 Yiddish books had been published by this publisher by the mid-1980s. Something very distinctive about Sovetish Heimland, though, and this has been commented upon by Gennady Estreich, based on his own firsthand experience, was the effort by the editor Vergelis to encourage and train a younger generation of writers and editors. Vergelis and his colleagues succeeded in that effort, although it was beyond their power to school a new generation of readers. Following the demise of the Soviet Union, Sovetish Heimland exerted a curious afterglow through the New York weekly Vorwärts, whose staff was revitalized then in the 90s with the infusion of a cadre of Soviet-born 40 and 50-somethings, including its then editor, Boris Sandler. And finally, last but not least, we come to a vast country that's home to Latin America's second largest Jewish community, Brazil. About 20 years ago, the Yiddish Book Center received a donation of about 250 Yiddish books from the personal library of one Yosef Landa, an artist and Yiddish cultural activist in Rio de Janeiro and subsequently Sao Paulo. And included in this donation was a modest and significant cache of Yiddish books that were published in Brazil during the 1940s. And you see on what you see on your screen is one of these, a book called Oisius der Zelen, The Letters Recount or Relate by Eliyahu Lipiner, published in Sao Paulo in 1941 with a cover illustration by a well-known Brazilian modern artist who happened to be a Jew born in Vilna, Lazar Segal. Another very productive Brazilian Yiddish author was Rosa Palatnik, and her short stories drew the attention of some of the most prominent Yiddish literati, including Opatoshu, Aaron Glantz Leolis, Yud Siegel, and Gittel Meisel. And the poet and critic Melech Ravitch warmly praised her narrative skills and the integration of Polish, Jewish, and Brazilian motifs in her work. Here's another writer who may be worth rediscovering. And her and other Yiddish books were distributed by her husband, Pinya Palatnik, who made the rounds whenever Yiddish books were offloaded at the port in Rio. He made the rounds of Yiddish cultural circles and gatherings, and that's where Yiddish books were distributed in Brazil, and that one way in which they were distributed. And not only Brazil, just about every locale in every country and on every continent where Yiddish books were produced and read during the 20th century. And that concludes my brief survey of the global phenomenon of Yiddish book publishing. And I'm ready to take questions when we resume.
Zachary, a huge thanks before we get to the end of this. That was absolutely fascinating, wonderful, and a really good sweep of the world in Yiddish publishing. You've taken us around the globe. So let's start off with a couple of questions. You've certainly got a lot of interest from people in terms of what's out there and what's available. I wanted to first share with everybody, if you go on to yiddishbookcenter.org and you search with the magnifying glass for 1,000 essential Yiddish books, you will find your way to this amazing list that Zachary compiled and referred to. There are several people looking for that. So again, just go on to the Yiddish Book Center's website and search for that title. I also will mention that books by Chaim Grada and I.B. Singer have now been digitized on our site thanks to permissions from the various estates. So those are wonderful additions to our digitized library. So let me begin with a question about the publishers. Were the publishers, did they enjoy renown, and were they successful in terms of business operators?
I don't think the publishing has been looked at from a business history standpoint properly or in great depth, but I'll mention Eric Goldstein, who's been doing work on the Yiddish publishers in New York and the interchange between New York and Eastern Europe before World War I. I don't have the citation handy, but he has published an article or two on that, and I know he's been working on that. I believe that Jeffrey Weidlinger has also worked on publishing in the Tsarist Empire. Of course, there has been scholarship on Kulturliga, which was not a commercial outfit. In terms of individuals who are identified and remembered, Kletskin is the prime example. And also I was asked a number of years ago to write an article about several other publishers and booksellers. One was about Hebrew publishing, and another Lidsky, and a couple of others. Successful? It really depends, you know, the business cycle and the assimilation cycle. I think those two, they play into how successful Yiddish publishing was commercially.
Funny you mentioned Kletskin, because that's the next question. Can you tell us a little bit more about who he was?
Well, this is one of those questions that I wrote a short article about Kletskin for the YIVO Encyclopedia, and that article is online, but I don't remember all of the details, but I will simply say that what I remember is A, he came from a well-to-do background, there was money there, and B, in the early years of his, before he became a publisher, he was also a political activist, a Bundist in the Tsarist era, period. And he underwrote, as I mentioned, a book publishing, a number of important journals, and his money ran out, though, at a certain point after World War I. One reason was that the family properties, the estates that the family made its living from, were located after World War I on the Soviet side of the border. There must have been some money there, though, to keep the house going in the 20s. And there's, but I'm hemming and hawing here, but I'd say go to YIVOencyclopedia.org if that's the URL, and look up Kletskin, and there you'll find a little bit more about him. Not a lot, but a little bit more about him.
Thanks. Were there differences in the way that the books were published and produced between basically the different cities and the different publishers?
Differences in the way they were, well, depends when and where you're talking, which country, which city, and whether you're dealing, what model of publishing you're referring to, whether it's a commercial outfit like Hebrew Publishing, or a book committee that is producing the works of Moshe Leib Halpern. You know, the avant-garde Yiddish poets in America were not being published by commercial publishers by and large. I mean, there's typography. You can tell. You can look at a book printed in Poland, and often even if you see enough of them, recognize, this must have been printed in Przemysl, and this must have been printed in Warsaw. You know, I don't know quite how to answer that question, quite what the nub of that question gets at.
Yeah. Right, we're going to go on to, if one were to delve further into Yiddish theater, what are some resources, digital collections to explore, or even favorite titles you might recommend? More specifically, are there any Yiddish one-act collections that you might also suggest?
So I would have to ask that person to contact me by email. And for an answer to that last question about specific one-act play collections, there doubtless are. I know I've seen one or two. Are we talking about plays in Yiddish or plays translated from Yiddish into English? That's a question for the questioner. As far as resources, there's the Digital Yiddish Theater Project, which I'm involved with. There's also something called the Museum of Family History and an associated website maintained by Stephen Lasky, which has, for example, translations of some of the entries in Zalman Zilbertzweig's Lexicon of the Yiddish Theater, which is a vast, 6 volumes were published, and then a 7th page proofs are on the Digital Yiddish Theater Project if you're looking for biographies of Yiddish Yiddish actors, playwrights, et cetera, et cetera. But I would start with Digital Yiddish Theater Project if you're looking for online resources, and Stephen Lasky's Museum of Family History and Museum of the Yiddish Theater. That's another one that he set up. And finally, also Amanda Miriam Chaya Siegel's, I think she has a research guide on the New York Public Library Dorot Jewish Division site. The award-winning librarian, she got an award today from the New York Public Library.
That was news today, and well-deserved news. Someone's asking if the book center has the total run of the Golden Kate. Yes, we do. And we had a big giveaway. Write to us at programs@yiddishbookcenter.org, and I'll write back to you. And if you want to write to Zachary, again, write to programs@yiddishbookcenter.org, and we will forward that on to Zachary directly. I'm curious, where was Yiddish publishing most prominent in Africa?
Almost certainly Johannesburg, though there was some publishing in Cape Town, and there may have been stray editions elsewhere in South Africa, and it's conceivable, though I haven't researched this, in what was called Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Finally, I will mention not book publishing, but when I worked at the Jewish Public Library, one of our members, he was a regular in the library, spent time, he was born in Poland, a Polish Jew who spent time in Alexandria. And there was Yiddish theater, little amateur Yiddish theater companies in Alexandria and maybe Cairo as well. And they produced playbills and things like that in Yiddish.
This participant says, I remember my parents hosting parties in our home in Montreal to raise funds to publish the works of local Yiddish writers and poets. Is this common everywhere?
I think it probably is. The examples I gave from Brazil, I think, testify to that. When you see Herausgegeben von a Komitee, published by a committee, that means somebody was passing the hat. And parenthetically, this is off topic, but if you look at the closing credit of the Coen brothers' very first movie, Blood Simple, you'll see that they did the same thing in my hometown of Minneapolis.
A good reference there. Do you consider the hundreds of Yizkor books that were published as Yiddish literature?
Well, Yizkor books are community memorial volumes. They, first of all, they are not uniformly in Yiddish, though some are. The contents of them were not necessarily, the Yiddish portion of the contents were not necessarily written for the books, the Yizkor Bücher, but were taken from other sources, or in some cases were written for them. I did include them when I was compiling those new book lists. There were Yizkor books still coming out in the 70s and 80s, etc. Literature, depends how you define literature. There's not much belles lettres, although you will find some poems and stories in there. But I mean, I'd recommend that you take a look at From a Ruined Garden, edited by Jack Kugelmass and Jonathan Boyarin, if you want a better and fuller sense of what went into a Yizkor book. Also, in the Jewish Gen website, there are translations of at least portions of many of them. So that will give you an idea of how literary, how Yiddish. Well, I don't have a firm statement on that.
Where does Yiddish Culture Itchy Goldberg edition fit into this picture?
It's rather far to the left. It was published, I hope you have, I'm sure you have copies also in some of those boxes at the Yiddish Book Center, and it would be great if they could be made, they could also be made available to interested libraries. But, it was a literary journal, Yiddish literary journal, and he was very much deeply steeped in Yiddish literary culture. Itchy Goldberg was.
I'm going to end with this last question. As you indicated that the only place on the globe without Yiddish publishing was Antarctica. Was there actually Yiddish publishing in the Arctic Circle?
Probably not, although there has been Yiddish publishing south of the Arctic Circle in Scandinavia, but north of it, and north of it in the Soviet Union, no. And Alaska, Canada, no. And I don't think that Montreal qualifies as north of the Arctic Circle.
Zachary, thank you again so much for this presentation and for all you do to work with us at the Yiddish Book Center. And I think you've really generated a lot of interest and very much set the scene for us for the year ahead with Yiddish, a Global Culture, which is our core exhibit that will open in 2023 on October 15th. More about that. And also as we have the Decade of Discovery, Yiddish around the world. So I hope you'll come back and share more.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, everybody, for listening in. And if you have questions that didn't make it, you know where to find me.
Great. Thanks again. Stay well. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. Thanks to our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli. Tonight's program is part of an ongoing series brought to you, as I like to say, live from the Yiddish Book Center. Please join us next Thursday, January 26th at 7 p.m. for a sneak preview. Yiddish, a Global Culture, the Yiddish Book Center's new core exhibit, as I mentioned, slated to open October 15th, 2023, with Mindel Cohen and David Mazauer. It's a pre-recorded program, and following, we will have a live Q&A, but you will get some great sneak previews of what's in store for you when you visit the new exhibit. To see the full schedule of events and to register for all of our programs, please visit yiddishbookcenter.org/events. I'd like to thank our members who make all of our ongoing work possible. If you are not a member, please consider joining. Your support really helps all of our programs. You can learn more at yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us this evening. We look forward to welcoming you back to our theater again next Thursday. Until then, stay well, stay happy and healthy. Good night.